And we are back. Section 5. The consistency of the Bible's claims with scientific observation. The Bible is not, as we have already discussed, primarily a book of science. Often people critique it as anti-science, though because they lack an understanding of how to properly interpret Scripture's various genres. For example, we would not read David's plea in Psalm 17 for God to shelter him under his wings to mean that God has wings. In a poetic genre under which Psalm 17 falls, the appropriate question is not, what does this say about God's literal physical characteristics, but rather, what truth does this poem speak about God's nature? Skeptics eager to disprove the Bible's purported scientific claims have often scoured its pages to find claims they know to be wrong. Most of them understand that writings of a poetic nature are not to be taken literally, but what about those passages that make literal historical claims? Those are fair game, are they not? This is why such critics usually zero in on the creation account in Genesis chapter 1. Using the tools of science, there are many things about Genesis 1 that at first blush don't make sense, such as how it was possible for there to have been light on the earth before the sun was created. To say that God could make it happen is unsatisfying to these critics, and they are all too happy to use their findings to conclude that Christianity is, in fact, anti-science. We shouldn't dismiss such concerns too quickly. A thoughtful reading of Genesis 1 clearly depicts a very literal-sounding creation story. It mentions the sun, moon, and stars, along with birds in the air and fish in the sea. These physical objects and living creatures actually exist, of course. The use of the word day in the creation account to denote a cycle of evening and morning sounds like the sorts of days we actually experience. Adam and Eve are depicted as actual people whose descendants can be traced through the biblical narrative down through the generations, even to the birth of Jesus. Jesus himself talked about Adam and Eve as if they were specially created by God in Matthew and Mark. So do the days of creation describe literal history? Is the Genesis 1 narrative intended to communicate a sequence of events as they actually happened? If so, scientists say Genesis 1 gets the facts wrong, and this casts suspicion on other biblical claims. There are four main ways Christians respond to the criticism of the claim that Genesis is factually inaccurate and unscientific. Young age creationism. Young age creationists say that as recently as 6,000 years ago, God created the universe in 6 24-hour days. Living organisms were created distinct and separate in much their present forms. Young age creationists respond to their critics by saying that Christians ought to interpret science from the standpoint of the Bible, rather than the Bible from the standpoint of science. If we do this, they say, we will see that scientists have misunderstood the data of the physical world. A handful of young age creationists are currently developing and testing hypotheses about the young age of the earth that they believe will explain this data better than an old earth hypothesis. Progressive creationism. Progressive creationists say God created basic kinds of living organisms separately, in something like their present forms, with the capacity to change and adapt to their circumstances over time, though within limits. Human beings were created separately by God at a much later time. This viewpoint holds that the days of creation were not literal 24-hour days and accepts mainstream scientific beliefs about an old age of the earth and the universe, though it rejects Darwinian claims about the evolution of all life from the first self-replicating molecule. Theistic evolution. Theistic evolutionists generally grant that evolutionary theory is true, but say God somehow initiated and oversaw the evolutionary process. Some believe that God sparked the first life and then worked through the natural process of evolution to bring about the diversity of life we see today. Others believe that the origin and evolution of life were completely natural events. In fact, some theistic evolutionists think God works only through natural causes. At some point, many theistic evolutionists believe God gave human beings souls. setting them apart from other creatures. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish the scientific views of theistic evolutionists from their atheistic counterparts, except for their qualifier. And by the way, God did it. That's what they say. So then you know it's a theistic evolutionist. Intelligent design. The fourth view has emerged in recent years to take insights about design and bring them into the scientific dialogue without commenting on the theological controversy among young age creationism, progressive creationism, and theistic evolution. According to advocates of intelligent design, or ID, from the cosmic architecture of the universe down to nanoscale molecular machines inside of cells, we find the marks of a designer. Many features of life are irreducibly complex, meaning they could not have evolved through chance-based Darwinian evolutionary processes and require an intelligent cause. Many scientists fail to see this. ID proponents believe, because they begin with a bias that says that only natural causes may be considered by science. They think the design hypothesis would check this naturalistic bias and yield greater scientific understanding. Intelligent design advocates take various positions on the age of the Earth, though most recognize intelligent design as consistent with an old Earth viewpoint and even with universal common ancestry. As you can see, young age creationism, progressive creationism, and theistic evolution are quite different. They all employ insights from intelligent design, but they make assumptions that contradict the assumptions of the others. They cannot all be equally true. Knowing this, organizations have developed around each viewpoint, hoping to recruit theologians, philosophers, and scientists to their way of thinking. If you listen to debates among Christians on the origins issue, you might find yourself thinking, can't we all get along? Well, yes and no. No, in the sense that some of the viewpoints, such as theistic evolution, take substantial theological liberties with the biblical text, leaving it difficult to see what about God's word might actually be true. For example, denying that God specially created the first man and woman. But yes, in the sense that all these viewpoints affirm that God exists, that he is a creator outside of and transcendent over his creation, that creation is good, that God's work brings him glory, and that humans bear God's image and are stewards of creation. These are theological claims on which Orthodox Christians agree. If we step outside the controversy for a moment, we'll see that several of the Bible's claims are consistent with the scientific observations of our day. Evidence of design in nature, something outside the universe bringing the universe into being, life arising from life and not from non-life, intention and order in creation, humanity being at the apex of creation and the limits to change in nature. Let's take a look at each of these in turn. 1. There is evidence of design in nature. Anglican clergyman William Paley's 1802 book, Natural Theology, was so widely respected that even Charles Darwin admitted, I do not think I hardly ever admired a book more. Paley offered what is now known as the watchmaker argument. A person chancing upon a watch in the wilderness could not conclude that the watch had simply always existed. Rather, the obvious design of the watch, including not only its internal makeup, but also the fact that it exists for a purpose, would necessarily imply the existence of its designer and not the product of natural processes. Paley went on to substitute the universe for the watch and contend that a mechanism so obviously designed as the universe could only be the product of a grand designer. As more details about the universe and living organisms are uncovered, the more we confirm the sort of design Paley saw with his limited scientific instruments. Remember, it was 1802. As Albert Einstein, who was certainly no creationist, said, the harmony of natural law reveals an intelligence of such superiority that, compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is an utterly insignificant reflection. More recently, physicist Paul Davies, who is mentioned earlier, does not professed to be a Christian, said, "Every advance in fundamental physics seems to reveal yet another facet of order." Biochemist Michael Behe, in his book Darwin's Black Box, coined the phrase irreducible complexity to describe the way molecular machines, such as the bacterial flagellum, and biochemical processes, such as blood clotting, exhibit design. Irreducibly complex features are those that, if reduced to simpler or fewer parts, could not still perform their required function. Take a mousetrap, for example. All of the parts must exist and be assembled at once if you want to catch mice. One cannot start with the wooden base and then, after catching a few mice, add the bait and then a spring. According to Behe, a gradual step-by-step evolutionary process cannot explain a biological system in which all of the parts either work together in harmony or don't work at all. Darwin taught that natural selection works on small improvements in function, but if a basic set of components must be in place before there even is function, then Darwinism has little to say about how complex organisms arose in the first place. Particularly among those scientists who have examined the tiny building blocks of life, there is growing suspicion of chance process explaining the complexity they see. Australian biochemist Michael Denton explains, although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than 10 to 12 grams, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. Even committed evolutionists recognize the unparalleled complexity of cellular systems. Former United States National Academy of Science President Bruce Alberts wrote in the prominent journal called Cell, "The entire cell can be viewed as a factory that contains an elaborate network of interlocking assembly lines, each of which is composed of a set of large protein machines. Why do we call the large protein assemblies that underlie cell function protein machines? Precisely because, like machines invented by humans to deal efficiently with the macroscopic world, these protein assemblies contain highly coordinated moving parts." Likewise, University of Chicago geneticist James Shapiro observes that no human contrivance operates with either the degree of complexity, the precision, or the efficiency of living cells. Evidence for design has only grown since Paley wrote about it almost 2 centuries ago. We now know that life is based upon an information-rich code in our DNA that provides building instructions for molecular machines inside our cells, which are full of coordinated, interacting parts that can operate at near 100% energy efficiency. But where, in our experience, do such things as language-based codes, computer-like programming commands, and irreducibly complex machines come from? They have only one known cause: intelligent beings. 2. Something outside the universe brought it into being. One of the greatest discoveries of modern cosmology is that the universe began with an unimaginably powerful explosion from an infinitely small and densely compacted point of matter and energy. The evidence shows that the universe is finite in space and time, and this requires that the universe had a beginning. Philosophically, everything that begins to exist has a cause. No causal chain we know of or can imagine is infinitely long, so there must have been a first cause. Theists call this uncaused cause God. Science has something to say about this as well. In Chapter 10, we briefly discuss the second law of thermodynamics, which posits that although the amount of energy in the universe remains constant, it does move from useful to less useful states, so there must have been a time when the energy clock began ticking. The implication is that the universe must have had a beginning. Just like a grandfather clock that is winding down, there must have been a point at which it was originally wound up. As philosopher and former atheist Anthony Flew observes, the universe is something that begs an explanation, and therefore, if the universe had a beginning, it became entirely sensible, almost inevitable, to ask what produced this beginning. Not only that, but as Christian theologians and philosophers are quick to point out, whoever began the universe must be capable of possessing the variety of characteristics we see in the world today. For example, moral force, intelligence, love, justice, and so forth are immaterial concepts that could not have plausibly arisen from material conditions alone. 3. Life does not come from non-life. Naturalists believe that nothing exists except that which has a natural origin. Materialists believe in only the world of matter. Both naturalists and materialists share the belief that somewhere, somehow, at some time, life arose from non-life, and that it managed to survive and increase in complexity and organization through mechanisms such as mutation and natural selection. These resulted in the variety of life we see today, including human beings. But how did this process begin? Life has never been observed to arise from non-life. Even laboratory experiments under carefully controlled conditions have produced nothing more than a small handful of the dozens of chemical building blocks essential for life. Unless something alive and outside the universe brought life into existence, naturalists and materialists are stuck with only one option. At some point, life must have arisen from non-life, a notion called spontaneous generation. The authors of one of today's most popular biology textbooks admit that Francesco Redi and Louis Pasteur's mid-19th century experiments unequivocally disproved spontaneous generation, and says that those who had believed in the spontaneous generation of microorganisms gave up their fight. 4 pages later, however, this same text suggests that research by Soviet biochemist Alexander Oparin and others make it possible to believe that life can arise from non-life. Stephen Garber's Biology, a self-teaching guide, possibly the most popular biology text available, uses the same arguments. Although modern evolutionary scientists would no longer endorse spontaneous generation in the way it was upheld in centuries past, they still believe in a version of Oparin's hypothesis, claiming that life arose from inanimate matter via unguided chemical reactions on the early Earth some 3 to 4 billion years ago. According to this view, there were many steps involved in the origin of life, but the very first was probably the production of a primordial soup, a water-based sea of simple organic molecules out of which life arose. While the existence of this soup has been accepted as unquestioned fact for decades, even this first seemingly simple step in most origin of life theories faces numerous scientific difficulties, like where did it come from? In 1953, a graduate student at the University of Chicago named Stanley Miller, you guys read about him in your physical science book for you ninth graders, along with his faculty advisor, Harold Urey, performed experiments hoping to produce the building blocks of life under natural conditions on the early Earth. The Miller-Urey experiments intended to simulate lightning striking the gases in the early Earth's atmosphere. After running the experiments and letting the chemical products sit for a period of time, Miller discovered that amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, had been produced. But do you remember the problems with it? Number 1, there was no oxygen. The lightning was a constant, like you never turned the lightning off, so there was always electricity in it. And when they saw the amino acids, they had to get them out quickly so that they wouldn't die. For decades, these experiments have been hailed as a demonstration that the building blocks of life could have arisen under natural, realistic, Earth-like conditions, corroborating the primordial soup hypothesis. However, it has also been known for decades that the Earth's early atmosphere was fundamentally different from the gases used by Miller and Urey. The atmosphere used in the Miller-Urey experiments was primarily composed of reducing gases such as methane, ammonia, and high levels of hydrogen. Reducing gases are those which tend to donate electrons during chemical reactions. Geochemists now believe that the atmosphere of the early Earth did not contain appreciable amounts of these components and lacked the reducing atmosphere used in Miller and Urey's experiments. An article in the journal Science put it bluntly: the early atmosphere looked nothing like the Miller-Urey situation. Consistent with this, geological studies have not uncovered evidence that a primordial soup once existed. Because of these difficulties, some leading theorists have abandoned the Miller-Urey experiment and the primordial soup theory it is claimed to support. In 2010, University College of London biochemist Nick Lane stated the primordial soup theory doesn't hold water and is past its expiration date. Instead, he proposes that life arose in undersea hydrothermal vents. But this isn't a clear-cut solution either. Assume for a moment that there was some way to produce simple organic molecules in a primordial soup, or that these molecules arose near some hydrothermal vent. Either way, origin of life theorists must then explain how simple organic molecules linked up to form long chains, such as proteins or RNA. Chemically speaking, however, the last place you'd want to link amino acids into chains would be a vast water-based environment like the primordial soup or underwater near some hydrothermal vent. As the National Academy of Science acknowledges, 2 amino acids do not spontaneously join in water. Rather, the opposite reaction is thermodynamically favored. In other words, water breaks protein chains back down into amino acids or other constituents, making it very difficult to produce proteins in the primordial soup. Materialists lack good explanations for these first simple steps necessary to origin of life. Chemical evolution is literally dead in the water. But even if a primordial sea filled with life's building blocks did exist on the early Earth, and even if it did somehow form proteins and other complex organic molecules, and even if more and more complex molecules formed until some began to self-replicate, and even if natural selection favored those that were better able to make copies, how would these molecules evolve into complex machinery such as that used in today's genetic code to survive and reproduce? Theorists are nowhere near an explanation. The most prominent option for the origin of first life is called the ribonucleic acid world hypothesis, RNA, in which some theorists postulate that the first life might have used RNA instead of DNA and proteins. But there are many problems with this hypothesis. First, the first RNA molecules would have to arise by unguided, non-biological chemical processes, but RNA won't assemble without the help of a skilled laboratory chemist intelligently guiding the process. New York University chemist Robert Shapiro critiqued the efforts of those who tried to make RNA in a lab, stating, "The flaw is in the logic that this experimental control by researchers in a modern laboratory could have been available on early Earth." Second, although RNA has been shown to perform many roles in the cell, there is no evidence that it could perform all the necessary cellular functions currently carried out by proteins. Third, the RNA world hypothesis does not explain the origin of genetic information. You still come down to, where did it come from? RNA world advocates suggest that if the first self-replicating life was based upon RNA, it would have required a molecule between 200 and 300 nucleotides in length. However, there are no known chemical or physical laws that dictate the order of those nucleotides. To explain the ordering of nucleotides in the first self-replicating RNA molecule, materialists must rely on sheer chance. But the odds of specifying, say, 250 nucleotides in an RNA molecule by chance is about 1 in 10,150 times 10 with 150 zeros. This is well below the universal probability boundary, below which events are not remotely possible to occur within the history of the universe. Robert Shapiro puts the problem this way: the sudden appearance of a large self-copying molecule such as RNA was exceedingly improbable. The probability is so vanishingly small that its happening even once anywhere in the visible universe would count as a piece of exceptional good luck. Fourth, and most fundamentally, the RNA world hypothesis does not explain the origin of the genetic code itself. In order to evolve into the DNA protein-based life that exists today, the RNA would need to evolve the ability to convert genetic information into proteins. However, this process of transcription and translation requires a large suite of proteins and molecular machines, which themselves are encoded by genetic information. This poses a chicken and egg problem, where essential enzymes and molecular machines are needed to perform the very task that constructs them. To appreciate this problem, consider the origin of the first DVD and DVD player. DVDs are rich in information, but without the machinery of a DVD player to read the disc, process its information, and convert it into a picture and sound, the disc would be useless. But what if the instructions for building the first DVD player were found encoded on only a DVD? You could never play the DVD to learn how to build a DVD player. So how did the first disc and DVD player system arise? The answer is obvious. A goal-directed, intelligent process created both the player and the disc at the same time. Life faces a similar conundrum. In living cells, information-carrying molecules, for example, DNA or RNA, are like the DVD, and the cellular machinery that reads that information and converts it into proteins are like the DVD player. Just like the DVD analogy, genetic information can never be converted into proteins without the proper machinery. Yet in cells, the machines required for processing the genetic information in RNA or DNA are themselves encoded by those same genetic molecules. The machines perform and direct the very task that builds them. This system cannot exist unless both the genetic information and transcription translation machinery are present at the same time and both speak the same language. Some sort of intelligence was required to provide the foresight needed to produce this complex system all at once. Despite decades of work, origin of life theorists are still at a loss to explain how life arose. In 2007, Harvard chemist George Whitesides was given the Priestley Medal, the highest award of the American Chemical Society. During his acceptance speech, he offered this stark analysis: the origin of life. This problem is one of the big ones in science. It begins to place life and us in the universe. Most chemists believe, as do I, that life emerged spontaneously from mixtures of molecules in the prebiotic earth. How? I have no idea. Dr. Whitesides is welcome to believe that the chemical origin of life occurred through unguided mechanisms, but we should not pretend his belief is anything but faith-based. The evidence, in contrast, suggests that a goal-directed scientific explanation such as intelligent design is necessary to produce the information and complexity we see in life. Because of the lack of evidence for the chemical origin of life, some biology texts compensate with a short section on panspermia, the idea that life arrived from outer space. This idea has attracted a few prominent supporters, including molecular biologist Francis Crick, who co-won a Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA. He explains why he gave up on the origin of life on Earth. An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Crick's panspermia hypothesis, of course, only shifts the problem a few thousand light years away. Now the question becomes, how did life begin in outer space? It is odd for scientists to place their faith in something they cannot observe, measure, or repeat, like that life mysteriously arose from an extraterrestrial source that would have had to have been spontaneously generated from inanimate matter. Even stranger still is that many of these scientists are quite critical of Christians for being unscientific. 4. There is intention and order in creation. The move from design to designer is called the design argument, because things may appear to human observers to have been designed, but may actually be without intention and order. This is why deoxyribonucleic acid is such a fascinating subject of study. Chemist Charles Thaxton believes DNA is the most powerful indicator of intelligent design. Is there any basis in experience for an intelligent cause for the origin of life? Yes. It is the analogy between the base sequences in DNA and alphabetical letter sequences in a book. There is a structural identity between the DNA code and a written language. That is, we can assume that DNA is the product of intelligence because it is analogous to human languages, which are without exception products of intelligent minds. When Francis Crick and James Watson discovered the structure of DNA, they trumpeted it as a condemnation of the God hypothesis and a debunking of religious myths. More recent research in genetics, though, indicates the presence of intention and order. The scientists who led the process to map the human genome, Francis Collins says DNA can be thought of metaphorically as the language of God. This is an astounding thing to have been said by someone who led the effort to solve the mysteries of DNA. In fact, DNA research is one factor that led Antony Flew, the legendary British philosopher, to renounce atheism. Flew writes, "The most impressive arguments for God's existence are those that are supported by recent scientific discoveries." He came to this conclusion because the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for new and enormously powerful argument to design. 5. Humanity is the apex of creation, both its final act and its caretaker. If you've ever taken time to look at the stars and consider the vastness of the universe, you may have found yourself thinking, how is it possible for life on this earth to be significant when the universe is so big? This is the very question raised by King David in a poem we now know as Psalm 8. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? In reflection on this question, some scientists find themselves compelled by the anthropic principle. Physicists John Barrow and Frank Tipler wrote about this argument in a book called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle. In one of its forms, the anthropic principle says we can observe the universe only because it exists in a way that allows us as observers to exist. In other words, the universe must have properties that make the existence of intelligent life inevitable. Robert Jastrow, highly regarded astronomer, physicist, and cosmologist, says, the anthropic principle is the most interesting development next to the proof of the creation, and it is even more interesting because it seems to say that science itself has proven, as a hard fact, that this universe was made, was designed for man to live in. It is a very theistic result. Likewise, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Charles Towne explains, intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be quite real. This is a very special universe. It's remarkable that it came out just this way. If the laws of physics weren't just the way they are, we couldn't be here at all. The sun couldn't be there. The laws of gravity and nuclear laws and magnetic theory, quantum mechanics, and so on have to be just the way they are for us to be here. And 6, there are limits to change in nature. Evolutionists who believe that all life arose from nothing, beginning with spontaneous generation, believe that mechanisms such as mutation and natural selection can explain all the variety of life we see today. Obviously, for this to be true, species must have been able to evolve into entirely different and more complex species over time. Mutation and natural selection can, according to evolutionists who take their theory all the way back to the origin of life, explain the production of and all the change in a vast array of structures, even a human eye, given enough time. The biblical account suggests a subtler approach. Genesis claims that God created creatures according to their kind, which implies groupings of animals. As we can observe through experimentation, many changes are possible within these groupings, but there seems to be a barrier beyond which they can no longer produce change in succeeding generations. This is the difference between microevolution, small changes within a species, and macroevolution, changes that lead to a new species. If a species can evolve only so far before it hits a barrier and is forced to remain the same species, then the idea of all species arising from one organism is problematic. Science simply has not been able to demonstrate that these barriers to change can be transcended. Zoologist Pierre-Paul Grasset, after studying mutations in bacteria and viruses, concluded, "What is the use of their unceasing mutations if they do not change? In some, the mutations of bacteria and viruses are merely hereditary fluctuations around a median position, a swing to the right, a swing to the left, but no final evolutionary effect." Similarly, U.S. National Academy of Sciences member biologist Lynn Margulis maintained that new mutations don't create new species. They create offspring that are impaired. Her explanation: mutations, in summary, tend to induce sickness, death, or deficiencies. No evidence in the vast literature of heredity changes show unambiguous evidence that random mutation itself, even with geographical isolation of populations, leads to speciation or a new species. In recent years, other core tenets of Darwinian theory, such as the tree of life, supposition that all of life had a common ancestor, have also come under attack. A 2012 paper in Annual Review of Genetics challenged universal common ancestry, instead suggesting that life might indeed have multiple origins. Likewise, in a 2009 article in New Scientist titled "Why Darwin Was Wrong About the Tree of Life," Graham Lawton wrote, "Many biologists now argue that the tree concept is obsolete and needs to be discarded." The article quoted scientists saying such things as, "We have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality," or "We've just annihilated the tree of life." The fact that change in nature seems limited to within species does not prove that the biblical idea of kind is a valid scientific concept, of course, but it does provide affirmation and make the biblical account seem less unscientific than many naturalists and materialists have assumed. Although those determined to reject any supernatural explanation of the world may remain unconvinced, the biblical account is closer to what we actually observe than is philosophical naturalism, which says that only nature exists and therefore everything came from nature. For the believer wondering whether he or she is obligated to reject the biblical account because of scientific advances, this kind of evidence helps restore balance and perspective. By restoring balance and perspective, we mean that it is more reasonable to focus on these larger issues when considering the relationship between science and the Bible than on minor issues, such as whether the ancient Hebrew understanding of what it means for a rabbit to chew its cud is the same as our understanding of what rabbits do when they move their mouths in a way that looks like a cow when chewing its cud. For a moment, let's return to the idea of theistic evolution. The belief that evolution can explain the variety of life on the planet today, but that God somehow guided the process. Is it the reasonable compromise position it appears to be on the surface? Section 6. Students who learn about evolution these days are usually taught that life evolved from inorganic chemicals to the human race within a period of some 3.5 billion years. Because this is stated as science-based fact, Christians who believe in a creator are made to feel ignorant, backward, and unintelligent. They shouldn't feel this way. Rather, they should understand that when the theory of evolution moves beyond science and into the realm of philosophy, it becomes nothing more than a story that materialists and naturalists tell one another to affirm their rejection of the supernatural. And that's important. The story of materialism and naturalism appears true to people because it enlists what biologist Jonathan Wells calls icons that are used to make it seem true. These icons include pictures of peppered moths and finches, drawings of horse fossils of various sizes, Ernst Haeckel's inaccurate drawings that make the embryos of vertebrate species appear more similar than they actually are, and drawings of the progression from primate to human. In his book, Icons of Evolution, Wells provides compelling evidence that these icons lack scientific rigor and are, in fact, misleading. Critics argue that Wells is asking too much of these icons and that he has nothing to replace them with. Such critics miss the point. If the evidence supporting the evolutionary story is flawed, then these icons are leading people to believe a story that simply has not been proved true. Christians suspect there is intelligence behind the universe, but they aren't the only ones. Paul Davies rejects the idea that everything in existence came about by chance. I cannot believe that our existence in this universe is a mere quirk of fate, an accident of history, an incidental blip in the great cosmic drama. Our involvement is too intimate. We are truly meant to be here. Similarly, atheist cosmologist Fred Hoyle states, a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology. Christians who study the Bible find such comments affirming. The idea of a living God who created all things and who maintains them by his immense nature and character makes a lot of sense in light of comments such as these. In spite of this, many Christian theologians and philosophers, the theistic evolutionists, have felt the need to reconcile their faith with evolution by proposing that God set up the universe, but then somehow allowed inanimate matter to naturally evolve into human beings. It is a controversial view among atheists and theists alike. Is it enough to say that God is behind evolution, and does that even make sense with the way we understand evolution to work as an unguided process? This is particularly the case with the seeming contradiction between the evolutionary account that humans evolved through purposeless, chance-based processes and the biblical account that Adam and Eve were specially created. Many biblical authors treated Adam and Eve as if they were historical people, not mere allegories to help explain our earliest human ancestors. Jesus did too. In Mark 10, Jesus declared, "At the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." Throughout the Bible, Adam is presented as a man who actually existed and whose sin brought condemnation and corruption upon all mankind, atoned for by Christ's death and resurrection. Denying Adam and Eve's existence creates a number of serious theological problems. Theistic evolution encourages us to drop that egg, but once we do, it's hard to put it together again. This is a difficult question for many believers, and it is one that is very much at the heart of the debate in our own time, given that the scientific evidence for human evolution is weak, and Darwinism undermines key Christian doctrines. One might wonder why some Christians are rushing to embrace an evolutionary viewpoint. There is perhaps common ground. In spite of very real and very serious differences, all of the various theistic perspectives on how creation took place can at least agree that humans are morally culpable creatures in a broken but privileged relationship with their Creator. Conclusion. In the end, when people say that Christianity is anti-science, they show they understand neither Christianity nor science. Finding himself in the midst of a debate over the mechanisms of evolution, atheist and evolutionist Paul Lemoyne wrote, "Evolution is a kind of dogma. which the priests no longer believe, but they maintain for their people. In other words, scientists are just as prone as anyone else to convincing themselves with wrong stories told repeatedly. Earlier in this volume, we learned that what makes faith valid is not that we have it, but that the object of our belief is actually worthy of belief. As we've examined the supposed conflict between faith and science, we can see that the battle is not at all what it first seems. Faith has its reasons. As authors Kenneth Boa and Robert Bowman say, science as a way of knowing can help inform biblical faith, and a biblical faith can help scientists be better at what they do. As C.S. Lewis puts it, in science we have been reading only the notes to a poem. In Christianity, we find the poem itself. Still, many critics of Christianity are not impressed. They believe that arguments about the Bible's truth are just word games. No religion is more or less true than any other, and it is intolerant to suggest otherwise. How to respond is the subject we'll tackle in Chapter 13.